Hey, good morning, y'all. Welcome to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Adam Keller, and this is Shop Talk, our new Thursday morning episode we're producing every week with a focus on labor education, history, and training. It's Thursday, May 25th, and we're broadcasting live from Spice Radio Studio in the heart of the Tennessee Valley here in Huntsville, Alabama. Every episode is live streamed on YouTube and Facebook and will be released on your favorite podcasting platform in the coming days. And sorry about the music intro. It was acting a little weird this morning, so wanted to cut that off before it all irritated us. Today on the show, after a couple training episodes in a row, we are switching gears back to history, and I'm really excited about this conversation. I'll be joined by Ben Wilkins, the editor of Braden Speaks. Just a reminder that the Valley Labor Report is a working-class media collective dedicated to lifting up labor struggles throughout Alabama and across the South. We bring you Alabama's only union talk radio show every Saturday morning, with the first half from 9:30 to 11 a.m. live on FM radio through WVNN here in the Huntsville listening area. The entire program is online via Facebook, YouTube, and podcast, and portions of the program are replayed on WZZA in the Shoals and WHIV out of New Orleans. We encourage you to check out our website, tvlr.fm, which we're currently expanding to feature published articles, including news and commentary relevant to working people. I just had an article out a couple nights ago about the latest development in the Bessemer Amazon campaign. The National Labor Relations Board has issued a complaint actually issued multiple complaints against Amazon this week, including one in Bessemer. So check that out for the latest. And while you're there, check out our store, tvlr.fm/store. You can check out our merch. For those of you watching, I've got my new shirt on today, our Good Things Union shirt. We do have some of those in stock, so check that out. And finally, we rely on donations and sponsorships to put out all of this free content. We appreciate the local unions and organizations that have sponsored ads on our main Saturday show. We are still looking for sponsors for Overtime and Shop Talk. I'm excited that we do have Labor Notes on board as our first sponsor for Shop Talk, and we really appreciate their support. But we are certainly interested in a couple more to sustain the series for the long haul. So beyond unions and allied organizations, other media outlets, union vendors and print shops, publishers, anyone who might be interested in reaching an audience of union activists and allies, definitely reach out to us, hit us up if you are interested in becoming a sponsor. And as much as we love and appreciate our sponsors, our single biggest source of contributions comes from listener donations. You can make a one-time donation or a recurring contribution at tvlr.fm/donate. And we also have a Patreon if you prefer to pay that way. And we'll take a good old-fashioned check mailed to our P.O. box. Whether you donate, share, subscribe, or just listen, we really appreciate your support, and we can't do it without you. We put out all of this content for free because we are dedicated to growing the Southern labor movement. If you share this mission, please support however you can so we can have media by, for, and of the working class. And at the Valley Labor Report, we are big fans of Labor Notes. Labor Notes is a media and organizing project that since 1979 has been the voice of union activists who want to put the movement back in the labor movement. Through their magazine, website, books, conferences, and workshops, Labor Notes promotes organizing, aggressive strategies to fight concessions, alliances with worker centers, and unions that are run by their members. Labor Notes is also a network of rank-and-file members, local union leaders, and labor activists who know the labor movement is worth fighting for. They encourage connections between workers in different unions, worker centers, communities, industries, and countries to strengthen the movement from the bottom up. With 40 years of movement building behind them, Labor Notes exist as a resource for leaders and union members who want to chart a new course for the labor movement. At the Valley Labor Report, we are proud subscribers and supporters. We encourage our listeners to be the same. Go to labornotes.org and find out more. So, as I mentioned today, we have a history episode, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have special guest Ben Wilkins. He is the editor of Braden Speaks, Selected Writings and Speeches from 1947 to 1999, and it was put out by Monthly Review Press. I'm a big fan of Monthly Review, so really appreciate their work and really appreciate Ben for coming on the show. So Ben, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Adam. Nice to be on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Um, Looking forward to the conversation. I have been learning already a little bit about Anne Braden, and I will admit up front that I did not know a lot. I had heard her name, but I really wasn't sure why I should know her. So this has been really cool for me to learn more about her. But before we get into your book and more about Braden's life, I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about yourself because I know that you are also dedicated to growing the Southern labor movement. You're a good union brother here in the South. And so tell us a little bit about your background and your journey in the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was born in 1982, so I'm 40 years old, and really, came up in a movement family, born and raised in Missouri. So, depends on how you define the South, sort of not the South, the up South, I guess you could call it. But both my parents, particularly my father, was very involved with labor and civil rights struggles, and so from a really early age, I got involved in whatever was going on. At that time, it was the anti-corporate globalization movement, did a lot of that kind of work in Kansas City, and organized against white nationalists in the Midwest. And then, really partially because of my understanding of race and class, and also reading a lot of Anne Braden, decided that the best thing I could do was join the labor movement. And so, initially as a rank and filer, worked in UPS and a lot of other warehouses and facilities around Kansas City, but then became a staff organizer with the Healthcare Workers Union in Detroit, Michigan. But always really thought that the most important thing I wanted to do, long term, was organize in the South. And so for the last 10 years, I've been in North Carolina organizing low wage, fast food, and service workers. First with Raise Up the South, which has morphed into the Union of Southern Service Workers, which was founded last year and is mostly operational in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, but mostly the Carolinas is where we've had most of our work historically. So, really my kind of understanding of Anne Braden has influenced the work that I do in really deep ways, and definitely consider myself a champion of the need for a strong Southern labor movement, not only for workers in the South, but to transform the whole country and the whole world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think it's critical to the fate of this country and the fate of this globe that we organize in the South. The South cannot be, we cannot allow the South to remain a fortress
Yeah.
for anti union bigotry and for a working class that is so exploited and oppressed here. So I really appreciate your work and appreciate you sharing that with me. And got a chance to meet some folks from Raise Up the South and now Union of Southern Service Workers. I know a few of those brothers and sisters came out to the Troublemaker School in
Oh yeah.
Alabama last fall, and so yeah, I'm really excited about the work y'all are doing. I'm probably going to be hitting you up after this call on getting some more guests from
Cool.
USSW and hearing more about the work y'all are doing. So. But that does segue into Anne Braden herself, because you mentioned how she has really guided your work and your analysis. And so, before we get into some of her activism and her organizing, could you just tell us a little bit about Anne Braden, the person? Who was she?
Yeah. Well, she was really an incredible woman, and understanding where she comes from, I think makes her story even more incredible. She was born in Anniston, Alabama, in 1924. A white woman. I think it's very important to understand that she was, white woman raised in a middle class family in Anniston in the 30s and 40s. And Aniston, I'm sure folks who are listening to the show kind of understand, a little bit about it, but it's best known historically as the place where a white mob, burned down a Freedom Rider bus in the 1960s. And so that's the kind of place that it was. And she really was not raised in a progressive family or a pro-labor family, to say the least. As she said, her dad was a committed racist. They were a pretty typical middle class white family in the Jim Crow era in Alabama. But she was an open-minded person and a sensitive person, raised, during the Depression, during the 1940s, and really was exposed to an entirely different world as a young woman, and really through the labor movement joined what she called the other America, not the America of the lynchers, not the America of the Confederacy or of the Klan, but the America of the Freedom Riders, of William Patterson, of Paul Robeson, of the CIO. And that's really who she was. She was somebody who was very much of the South, of the white South, and who revolted against the Jim Crow system, and primarily and fundamentally at the beginning, really through the labor movement.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. I'm always interested to hear the stories of folks who kind of cut against the dominant narrative and go against, the way they were raised. And certainly that's something I can relate to, having been born and raised in the South, and certainly not in a
Yeah.
progressive household by
Yeah.
any stretch. I always find that interesting, what moves people, what kind of jolts them out of that dominant narrative that's been so instilled in us. And you mentioned the labor movement was really key to her journey. And one thing I've really been fascinated with Anne Braden is how she is sort of she has her, like one foot in the labor movement, one foot in the civil rights movement. It seems like throughout her entire journey, and something that I've heard you speak about elsewhere is how there was a real separation between those movements, in large part due to the Red Scare.
Right.
But Anne represented a continuation
Right.
of those struggles. Uh, could you talk a little bit more about Anne's experience with the labor movement?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So she became a journalist out of college, and moved to Louisville, Kentucky. And for her, Louisville was a way to escape the Deep South. Um, of course, still in the South, but for
Right.
her, going to a place like Louisville was, a place where she could feel a little bit more freedom than being in Birmingham or in Anniston, where she had been previously.
I can
Uh,
say I really relate to that as a Southerner because going from Meridian, Mississippi to Huntsville, Alabama, it felt like I was going up north. And
yeah,
certainly
yeah.
seemed like a much more progressive area. And so, yeah, that resonates for sure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of places like that in the South. I mean, I live in Durham. It's a place where a lot of people who, come from small towns look to a place like Durham or Chapel Hill or Huntsville or, Columbia, South Carolina, where they can have a little bit more freedom, and where there's a little more uh, open-mindedness, I guess you
Right.
could say.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. So for her, Louisville was that. She got a job at the newspaper in Louisville, and at that point, she was, becoming a little bit more open-minded. She said that she really was exposed to the inhumanities of the Jim Crow system as a court reporter in Alabama. And so that was kind of her first inkling of, something is wrong, something is not right about this system. But then going to Louisville, she was really lucky, because she was introduced to this really powerful labor movement in Louisville at the time. We're talking about 1947. The Red Scare had really not uh, become the full force that it would become in the years later. And so you had, what was called the Seventh Street unions, really anchored by the farm equipment workers at the International Harvester plant in Louisville. But there was other unions, UE, other industrial unions that were really powerful and militant and radical. And she was really incorporated into that universe. She, I think, most fundamentally was really struck by the multiracial nature of it. You had white workers and black workers marching side by side against, these powerful corporations, against white supremacy. And it was there that she met her future husband, Carl Braden, who was, named after Karl Marx. He was, from a family that, had been really big supporters of Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party family. His dad was, if I'm not if I'm remembering correctly, a railway worker and a trade unionist. And so it was really through, making those connections and becoming a part of that movement that she was exposed to this whole new world. And a lot of times people, they think about the civil rights movement and the labor movement as two different things, but at that time in that place, it was one movement.
Right.
And for the rest of her life, she really struggled to work to build that one movement of uniting the struggle for the working class and the struggle against racism into one fight, which really it is at the end of the day, particularly in the South.
Right, absolutely. So she saw it as one fight, and
Yeah,
anti-racism was something that was a central part of
yeah.
her life and who she was and what she was about. So could you talk a little bit more about the anti-racism and how that really was such a big part of Anne Braden?
Yeah, well, and I mean, of all the, she's really most known for that aspect of her, and I think for good reason. She, again, was raised and matured in the Jim Crow South, and I think, fundamentally, the thing that held down the working class in the South was Jim Crow and white supremacy. And so for her, really like the fundamental thing that had to be confronted in order to build power for the working class and to build a more democratic society was racism in all of its manifestations. And so, that meant, the actual economic system of Jim Crow, which was based on sharecropping and peonage that primarily impacted black workers, but also the racism of white workers, and really believed that the fundamental thing that could absolutely transform the South and could demolish the power structure was if there was a solid block of poor white people, working class white people who were marching in unison with the Black freedom movement that was growing. And so, for her, that was really her life's work. Was how do you there's this Black freedom movement that's powerful. You've got Dr. King, you've got Fred Shuttlesworth, you've got Stokely Carmichael, you've got SNCC. All this really powerful work is happening. How can we as white people incorporate, a growing number, not only of white middle class people, of white students, which was also very important, but really most fundamentally, how do we recruit and build a movement of white workers that's joining alongside that freedom movement? And that's a part of that. And for her, that was the most critical work that she could be doing and that she spent her whole life, working to do.
Right, right. And, that's something that really resonates with me because I truly believe that interracial people power, a diverse working class movement that's organized is really the only way we move forward in the South and demolish some of these power structures and build a more livable future for all of us. And so, yeah, it's just it's inspiring for me to hear that commitment, and particularly because she is someone who faced repression and backlash. She suffered for her beliefs, right? Like so many activist visionaries. Could you talk a little bit about that and like how throughout her life she really demonstrated tremendous courage?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll talk about the context first and
Sure.
I'll talk about what personally happened to her and her husband. You know, late 1940s, early 1950s was the period of McCarthyism when the entire United States power structure went to war with the movement of the left at that point. And anti-communism was really the dominant ideology of the time. And so, you had show trials all across the country. You had congressional hearings. You had purges of unions. You had thousands and thousands of people in the U.S. who had been activists in this militant movement who were hounded and who were repressed in all kinds of different ways, sent to prison, their lives ruined, their professions ruined. The Rosenbergs were executed. There was all kinds of this stuff that was happening at the time. And so she really got caught up into that. So in 1954, she and her husband had a friend, Andrew Wade, who had been active in the Progressive Party, which was a pro-labor political party at the time. And he was a black man. Him and his wife were trying to get a house. They had a young family and could not find a house that was big enough for their family in the segregated black neighborhoods of Louisville. So the Bradens agreed to basically buy the house under their name and transfer it over to the Wades to allow them to get into this house. A very simple act of, personal solidarity.
Right.
Uh, and really for that, they were put on trial. It's a long story. I won't tell the whole story, but essentially, Carl and Anne were put on trial for sedition for the simple act of buying a house that a black family could move into in a segregated
Wow.
neighborhood. And that was the first of three times that the Bradens were charged with sedition, which I think has got to be some kind of a record. I don't
Oh
know if
my
anybody.
gosh. Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. So they were hounded throughout their whole lives. Carl spent a year in prison, and Anne Braden really could not find stable employment. And it was then that she basically went full time into movement work because she had to. She had no other options. She became a journalist for the Southern Conference Education Fund, which we can talk about. But yeah, I mean, that was, obviously an incredibly difficult moment for her. But she also said later that that was the moment when, she actually was forced to make a full and complete break with the Jim Crow society because she had no other option.
Right.
She was demonized, and there was a certain freedom in being demonized. She has a really, I think, powerful letter to Dr. King in the book in 1960 where she's saying, you know, it's really amazing that you've won this Nobel Prize and that you're this prominent person, but don't be afraid of being demonized. Don't be afraid of being outcast. Stick true to your principles. Because that's what Jesus would have done. She was also very good at speaking in these kind of religious terms because she was a deeply faithful person. So, yeah, the repression that she and her husband faced was pretty intense throughout the 1950s and 60s. They had a FBI agent who was assigned full time to watch them. And the book goes a little bit more into that. So she was not afraid to face down the power structure and really did suffer the consequences throughout her life.
Right, right, absolutely. And one thing you just mentioned that I really have been fascinated with, and I wanted to discuss. You mentioned she was a deeply faithful person,
Mhm.
and Anne Braden was a person who was influenced by Marxism and Christianity, and
Yeah.
that's something as a Southerner, I was raised to believe they're polar opposites. They're at odds. Um, One's bad, one's good, and it's a very simplistic approach to it. And so that is something I find fascinating as well. Sort of this fusion of Marxism and Christianity. Do you have anything really to talk about there? Just because I personally find that really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it was really fundamental to her whole worldview. She was raised in the Episcopalian Church in Alabama and really never lost that commitment to her faith, even though she pretty much rejected everything else about her upbringing. Um, and in other parts of the world, I think the fusion of Christianity or of morality or faith with Marxism is really not so out of the ordinary. I mean, in Latin
Right.
America, it's pretty typical. And even in the South, it was at that time, um, pretty normal. There's a scene in, Robin Kelly's book Hammer and Hoe, which I'm sure you've read, where one of the militants in the movement had, a book by Lenin and a Bible, like, side by side. So that kind of fusing of the two, I think has been pretty typical in years past, if not these days. But what she believed was you really couldn't live up to Christian values without having some understanding of class and a class analysis, which was what, for her, Marxism really offered. And she had a really, I think, penetrating analysis of this in a lot of different ways. And one of the things she said was that, she's writing in the 1980s, looking back on the 60s and the 70s and, this time period when you have this really radical upsurge and then a repressive, backlash that led to Reaganism. And what she said is in the 60s, in the early 60s, that kind of, classic period of the civil rights movement, we were really good at having a moral fire and at, lifting up this vision of a beloved community and people like Dr. King, speaking to our faith values. And then, in the late 60s and the 70s, a lot of people made this turn towards Marxism and really got a good understanding of material analysis and of class analysis. But the thing that never was able to happen in the movement as a whole was for the two to be fused, to have a moral
Mm,
analysis and a material analysis. And you've got to be able to do the two things at the same time, was what she believed. And so that's, I think a really important insight of hers, that especially in the South, those of us who are, building a mass movement, you've got to be able to analyze society and to speak to the moral and faith traditions of the South.
absolutely. And I think to speak to, a spiritual yearning that we feel under this system.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that's really really important, and I really I've enjoyed learning more about that about her.
Right.
And you mentioned in terms of backlash, and a couple of things that come to mind. It would be in some ways the Jim Crow era and the lynching era itself was backlash to expressions of interracial working class political power. Right here in Alabama, we have the Constitution of 1901, which was a counter revolution essentially
Mhm.
against interracial populists who, by all accounts, won the governor's race in I believe, 1896. And so, you know, that was a form of reaction. And then uh, as you get into the late 70s and 80s, of course, we see this new wave of reaction to the civil rights era. And one thing about Anne Braden that I've learned is that when the Greensboro Massacre took place, she showed up in Greensboro pretty much immediately and was there. Could you speak a little bit about the Greensboro Massacre and what Anne Braden's role was in that aftermath?
Yeah, yeah. I think Greensboro Massacre is a really important historical event that folks, I think, have to understand if you want to understand the past 50 years of our history in the South.
Absolutely.
So, in Greensboro, just like in a lot of cities all around the country and in the South, there was a generation of activists who had matured through the civil rights years, through the 60s, and had really been radicalized and had started adopting a lot of these Marxist ideas that we talked about. And so they formed an organization called the Workers' Viewpoint Organization. It was one of many, many organizations that was, trying to build working class power in the South. And, we're holding an anti-Klan demonstration, a demonstration against the Ku Klux Klan in 1979, and a caravan of Klansmen and Nazis basically came to the demonstration and murdered five of the demonstrators in broad daylight on TV. There's news cameras there. You can see the footage on YouTube, and that was really a dramatic moment, I think, for the whole country and for the whole movement. People had this understanding that there's a rightward turn going on. There's a reactionary turn happening in this country. But I think that really was a shock to the system of the
Mm,
whole conscience of, the movement at that time. And, just like she had been in the 1940s and 50s, these folks, I think it's not widely remembered now, but a lot of the demonstrators who were murdered and their comrades who were still alive were really demonized at the time, because they were communists, they were leftists, they were radicals. And so there was a lot of people in the broader movement who were actually, even though they were shocked that these murders had happened, there was a lot of fear of associating with these folks who had been murdered. And Anne Braden did not feel any of that fear. She believed we had to stand in solidarity with the victims of the massacre. And so, as soon as she heard about it, she hopped in her car, drove to Greensboro. She already knew, some of the folks a little bit who had been involved, and offered her assistance. And I think it was really a key um, figure in really building a mass movement to fight back against the Klan and to support those who had been massacred. And so, a lot of the veterans of that struggle who, we in USSW are really close with, Reverend Nelson and Joyce Johnson, Roz Pellis, others who were survivors of the massacre, really remember her solidarity in that moment and the way that she showed up. And I think it's really important to remember that massacre and the what it signaled for the direction of the country. And she played a really important role in building the fight back.
absolutely, absolutely. And I want to transition there to talking about the book itself, because when we're talking about remembering and learning from this history, uh, I believe that's probably, why we have this book, right? So I wanted to ask you why Anne Braden speaks, why this collection of her writings and speeches, and why now. And I think you've already spoken to it a little bit, but, just tell us a little bit about the book itself and why you felt it was important to get this out there.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty simple. I mean, one is she's speaking to the contradictions that still exist in this society, the crisis that
Right.
still exists in society of poverty, racism, and militarism, and all the problems that she was fighting to overturn. They still exist, maybe even worse so. And the second thing I would really strongly suggest in terms of why it's important to read this book and read her writings is that, she, I think, proposed and represented a tradition of struggle that oftentimes we forget. And, in the progressive world or the left world or whatever you want to call it, oftentimes we silo our struggles. But she really firmly believed that you had to build a united movement for democracy, for justice, for equality. And that meant that the labor movement had to be marching side by side with the racial justice movement and the anti-war movement and the environmental justice movement. All the enemy is the same. When she's fighting in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan is the enemy of all these movements. And therefore, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to unite together. And, the third thing I would say is she also, you talked about labor notes earlier, bringing the movement into the labor movement. She wanted to bring the labor movement into the social justice movement and to really fuse the broader social justice struggles with the labor movement. And she believed that it was critical for, the racial justice movement, the social justice movement of the country to really incorporate labor struggles into it, and for the labor movement to lift up all of the social struggles that are happening at the time. And so I think that approach to movement work and to politics is critically important for all of us to remember and to adopt today. So I think that the way that she approached movement work is the way that we all need to approach movement work today. And you cannot understand the civil rights movement without understanding her contribution and also looking at her analysis of it.
Right, right. And something that I picked up from another interview that you had was that, she believed you couldn't go around race. You had to
Right.
go through race and tackle issues of race head on when you were
Yeah.
organizing in the South. And I think that's very powerful, and I think it's something that is just as true today as it ever was.
Yeah.
Was there anything else in terms of maybe lessons that we can learn from Anne Braden and her work, whether that's represented in the book or elsewhere? Just anything you think that contemporary Southern activists, particularly in the labor movement, what is it we should be looking towards with Anne Braden's work and writings to kind of learn from and implement? And you spoke about this a little bit already, but uh, anything else that really comes to mind in terms of how her approach and her analysis can be helpful?
Well, I think one big thing is that she had an analysis and she was a thinker.
Right.
And
I mean, and that is
yeah,
something we
yeah,
have to acknowledge is not
yeah,
happening a lot in
yeah.
our movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she had a deeply well thought out analysis. Anybody, folks who knew Anne Braden, who spent time with her and with Carl, first thing they always talk about is you go into the living room and there's a million books, and all, they were constantly reading, they were constantly analyzing, thinking about not just what's going on in Alabama or in Kentucky, but what's going on in El Salvador, what's going on in Eastern Europe, what's going on in Vietnam, and what's the history that brought us to where we are. One of my favorite essays in the book is called 500 Years of Racism in U.S. Foreign Policy, and it's basically just about it's written in 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbia, coming to the so-called New World. And she just analyzes the history that got us here over the past 500 years. So I think that kind of depth of understanding is needed. And oftentimes in the movement, I think we separate the work of organizing and the work of thinking. And oftentimes, I find this with a lot of people who are in more organizing spaces. There's kind of a condescension towards so-called intellectuals, and then with folks who are more university oriented or are doing the intellectual work, there's a condescension to people that are in the day-to-day struggles. And I think we have to fuse the two, just like she fused, morality and material analysis. You've got to be able to fuse thinking and fighting. And she really modeled that. And I think it's very important for all of us to do, to have a big picture analysis as we're doing our day-to-day work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, was there anything else you really wanted to highlight about the book itself? Um, is there something in there that's just flat out your favorite, or anything that you really just kind of want to point to in terms of the book itself?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there's anything that's my favorite, but what I would say is that there's a very the biggest essay in the book is called "The Southern Freedom Movement in Perspective." It was written in 1965 for Monthly Review magazine. It's a long essay. It's the longest thing in the book, but I think it's really an incredible analysis in the moment of what was going on. And so I think for two reasons it's important. One is that if you want to understand the 1960s, if you want to understand the civil rights movement, read that essay. It's the best summary I've seen. And then second, it's a model for, what I think we have to do, which is to be able to be in the struggle and to step back and
Mm.
and view it from a long view and a 30,000 foot view. And so she's really doing that in the essay. And it's really powerful. And I think just I, to this day, can't think of another piece of writing that better encapsulates, what was happening in the South throughout the 1950s and 1960s, that really produced the civil rights movement and the victories of it, and that really characterized the struggle. So I really highly recommend that essay. If you don't read anything else, read that essay. It's really incredible.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Ben Wilkins, I really, really appreciate your time. I appreciate the work you've been doing, both in organizing here in the South and also with getting this book out. And Braden Speaks, Selected Writings and Speeches, 1947 to 1999. And again, that's from Monthly Review Press. Shout out to Monthly Review. I'm a big fan. And Ben, was there anything else you wanted to say before we let you go?
No, really appreciate being on, and love your program, and solidarity to everybody that's building labor power in Alabama.
Hell yeah. Absolutely. Thanks, Ben. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, folks. So you heard that. Ben Wilkins and Braden Speaks. Really, really enjoyed that interview. I have enjoyed learning more about Ann Braden. Someone in the chat mentioned how they had not heard of Ann Braden, and it's somebody that we really ought to be studying and learning about. And there are a lot of figures like that lost to history that are not just fascinating, but people that we can really learn lessons from and that are relevant to today's struggles. And so, yeah, I really appreciate those of you who've been commenting today. I know there's been some good comment section today. Lenny mentioned that, in his opinion, we need to fuse emotion with effective action. And it sounds like to me that was something that Ann Braden was really, emphatic about, that we speak to people's morality, we speak to people's material conditions, and the two are certainly connected. So really, I've enjoyed learning more about Ann Braden. Look forward to picking up the book, and it was great to chat with Ben Wilkins, and appreciate the work he's doing, both on the intellectual side and on the organizing side. And as he said, the two have to work in tandem. So as I wrap things up this morning, I did want to mention some excellent upcoming training opportunities from Labor Notes. They do have their workshop, What to Do When Your Union Breaks Your Heart. Their June edition has been scheduled. It's June 6th. That's a Tuesday. It'll run from 6:30 to 8 p.m. and it is on Zoom. It is free. So if you're a union member and you've ever had your heart broken by one of your own leaders, if you've ever gotten involved and had nowhere to go, or you feel like you've had some issues inside your union, this is a workshop that'll help you figure out how to kind of recommit to the union and change the culture into one where leaders respect and serve the members. So definitely check that out. They, of course, have a stewards workshop every month. They actually just had theirs this week with Bob Schwartz. He is a fantastic labor attorney. He literally wrote the book on just cause, and that was the subject of May Stewart's workshop. So I'll keep you posted on June. And final plugs would be to check out tvlr.fm. As I mentioned, we've got some new work published. We just published an article detailing education legislation in Alabama. So if you're interested in what's happening with Alabama's public schools in the legislative session, check that out for sure. And we'll have more good stuff on the way. We've got some good interviews planned for Saturday. Really looking forward to that. We've got a full show on Saturday with some Memorial Day tie-ins, some labor news in Alabama and across the South. So y'all check it out. And that is it for the 12th episode of Shop Talk. Hope it was worth your time, and I really appreciate everyone listening. And again, if you enjoyed it, please share with your network and make sure that you're plugged into our work. You can sign up for our email list. You can, of course, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, at the Valley Labor Report. And again, Saturday morning, we've got a great show planned, 9:30 a.m. Central Time, live on WVNN, YouTube, and Facebook. And finally, if you share our mission to grow the Southern labor movement, if you share our belief in the power of solidarity and collective organization, and if you want media that is for working people, by working people, please consider becoming a recurring donor at tvlr.fm/donate. All power to the workers. Solidarity, y'all.